My name's Fiona Carter. I'm the Director of Education for Wellington Colleges International. Look after our group of international schools. We have some in China, some in Thailand, a brand new one in Pune. So my colleague Rashmi Dixon is joining me today from India to talk about how they use the Leuven scales brilliantly. We've also got, if you like, the mothership, as I call it, or our first school is the Wellington College in England, which is where I'm now based. I'm part of the special interest group for ECIS, who are the Education Collaborative for International Schools. And so if perhaps, I wonder, Abby, if we could go on to the next slide, that would be good. And there's a QR code there to see as well. Many of you will be a member school of ECIS. If you're not, I would urge you to be so, because there's so much great stuff going on. We were very lucky in terms of the early childhood special interest group to be part of and help organise a conference 2 weeks ago now, actually probably about 10 days ago in Doha in Qatar. And it was just so uplifting and inspirational to be with so many people who are passionate about, interested in, experts in early years. Please do follow our special interest group. There's lots more of these coming up. And if you would like to share any of your information, then we're always really, really supportive of that. Okay, we'll go on to the next slide, Abby, please. Thank you. Okay. I've been asked to speak today about something which is really, really close to my heart, and that's the measuring of well-being and involvement and the use of the Leuven scales. Now, many of you may have heard of it. Some of you, I'm sure, will be using them. So I'm just going to give you a snapshot of how we use them at Wellington College International. I've personally been using the Leuven scales for many years, and I've used it as a teacher myself. I've used it across groups of schools when I was an inspector, when I've supported school improvement in either local authorities or working for government. To me, using the Leuven scales is just the most genuine way to really unlock the potential of a child. And I'll talk a little bit later about the great data it can produce as well. So in summary, the Leuven scales are an approach, I think, more than a system of measuring well-being and involvement. It's a 5-point scale, and I will show you a little bit later on what that looks like. And it's about measuring, scoring well-being and involvement, and then triangulating that data, because it is numerical data, with progress, with attainment, with the quality of teaching, supporting parents to understand what's really going on inside the child. And I've chosen these few images because the one particularly at the top, that fish in water, that's what Professor Ferre Laevers, and I'll talk to him in a moment about him, that's what he would say we want our children to be like, really happy in their own skin, comfortable in their own skin. We want our children and our pupils, as much as we want ourselves, to be honest, to be open, to have that resilience, that bounce back ability. You know, if children have high levels of well-being and involvement, it's not all the time, but what it does mean is that they have that security, those really strong foundations, that if things don't quite go their way, or it's a difficult day, or they're missing their grown-up, then they have that real inner core, that inner strength to get them through that difficult situation. The picture in the middle is the Mona Lisa, of course. And if you've ever followed the work of Matthew Savage, he talks about the Mona Lisa effect. He talks about what's going on behind the eyes. And the Leuven scales are all about understanding the process that's going on within the child. And for me, the one about the iceberg as well is about how much we know children, and do we really know what they're thinking, what their home lives are like? Do they know how tired they are, how hungry they are? All of this is just about unlocking what we don't know about the child and then supporting them further and improving those real critical components of learning, development and progress, which is well-being and involvement. That picture at the bottom there of the little girl with the drum kit, that was in our school in Hangzhou. It was a deconstructed drum kit. I actually ought to have that on a whole screen. Just look at her, the energy, the openness, the absolute will and love of life in that moment. And then we've got the little boy next to her who's working with clay. He's only 2, but he has got that true indicator of high levels of involvement, which are, sorry, it's all going very funny, which is the tongue out. It's the child with the tongue out. That's the one that we look for to say that children are really, really involved in what they're doing. It also shows that what that child is experiencing, what they've set up, is the right level of challenge for them. They know how to use those resources. They're involved enough. They're engaged in. It's not too easy and it's not too hard. And for those of us in early years, particularly because we talk a lot about the learning environment, when we see children with that look of really high levels of involvement on their face, that furrowed brow, we know we're getting it right. So high levels of involvement, high levels of well-being equate essentially to really great, outstanding, excellent conditions for learning. Thank you, Abby. Now, I'm just going to ask, my screen is flickering. Is everybody else's? Or is it okay for everyone else? Okay, I'll carry on. Mine all looks a bit strange, but I'll carry on if it's okay for all of you. So setting the scene. Why do we use the approach? At Wellington International, we use it across all our early years. It really is that golden thread. For me, the great thing about the approach of the Leuven scales is that it's numbers. You know, and numbers are taken really seriously, particularly if we are working in through schools. So data is more than numbers, but this is something which measures those really, really, as I've said, critical components of high levels of wellbeing, high levels of involvement. And then we will triangulate the scores that the Leuven scales give us with all the other aspects that a lot of our boards understand. And I've used it strategically in terms of what we need in our schools, whether it's purchasing, whether it's higher quality levels of staff, those kind of things, as well as self-reflecting as a teacher. The scales are also really, really great tool for that check and balance about what we're offering our children in terms of quality of teaching data. Again, it can be used. It can be used in appraisals. It can be used in terms of self-reflection. What I would say is that if you really start to use the Leuven scales, at first it might be very systematic, but eventually it should just be the first part of the conversation when a teacher talks to you about what's happening in their classroom. Wellbeing is great this week. Involvement's a little bit low. I think it might be because of the learning environment, or perhaps because of this, this, and this. That's the kind of, that's the way I really want our teachers to articulate what's happening in their classrooms. And then think about that, how that links with all the rest of the data that we talk about. Okay, the next one, please. So we're going to stop just for 5 minutes. And I want you to think about your levels of wellbeing and involvement. Because although traditionally the work of Ferre Laevers is used in early years settings, it really is not age and stage related at all. Certainly in Belgium, where the Leuven scales were developed at the University of Leuven. Now, you will notice how difficult that is. Professor Ferre Laevers developed them in Leuven. And I don't speak Flemish, but I think it's just a coincidence that they sound very similar. It's not age and stage related, but it is often something with the use with younger children. But what I want you to do for 5 minutes in breakout rooms, and Abby's going to enable that to happen in a moment, is think about where your levels of well-being and involvement are the highest. What are you doing? Who are you with? Where are you? Because that's the feeling we want to create for our pupils. So I think Abby's going to come out of the presentation for 2 minutes and then go into breakout rooms, and then you can talk amongst yourselves, and then we'll maybe share for a short time after that. Thank you. Sophia, you tell us about your well-being and involvement. Where is it highest?
There she is. Jessica's got her hand up too. I see the girl in my group who we chatted about the involvement when kids are being creative and when they're working on small groups. We had very similar ideas. I'll let Jess chime in because she had some really nice examples. So
okay, thank you.
Sure.
Hi, Jess.
Hello. Hi. I just put my hand down because I thought it was being taken over, but not to worry. I thought, oh, great. We thought about creative activities more than anything. So, for example, like the big block play in the classroom, I see children really, really motivated to build things like aeroplanes and cars and buses that they can actually sit in and role play in.
Yeah.
Like they seem like very excited to make that. And creative activities where they're using all the crafting things. But for me, I find it more when it's self-chosen. So they're doing junk modeling, or they're getting you know, like color papers and sellotape, and they're designing their own plan. Basically, I see them really, really motivated in those situations. And I've recently bought in plasticine because we had Play-Doh for quite a long while, and it's all different colors, and they're modeling and doing sculpture with it. And again, they are so involved in it, like you almost can't ask a question because they're that focused on it.
Yeah.
So for me, it's those main areas. Yeah.
And I think you're right. I mean, you talked there about self-chosen and motivation. And the thing about the Leuven scales is it doesn't dictate an approach which will create the highest levels of wellbeing involvement, which was what I quite like. It doesn't say to have the highest levels of wellbeing involvement in terms of pedagogy, you have to be very child initiated, very play-based, very formal. What it does say is that where children are demonstrating high levels of wellbeing and involvement, you know, as a teacher, you're getting it right. But having said that, of course, it is much more likely that children will have higher levels of wellbeing involvement when they are choosing what they know and they're comfortable, again, in their own skin. And I think if you think about yourself as a person, where your highest levels of wellbeing involvement, and if we were all together in a big room, we'd probably spend half an hour talking about this, and I'd get people to close their eyes and imagine their high levels of wellbeing. And, you know, you get some people who say it's when I'm in the bath. Wine is involved quite a lot. Also, or it's something really active. But so for some people, being really active gives them a high level, or being with their family, or with some people, it's being by themselves. And what's interesting is that when you ask people about wellbeing and involvement, their own wellbeing and involvement, often a bit like you've just said about the children being highly involved with doing something, people who are active will say it's knitting or you know, or baking something. I'm quite a horsey person, and I love being outdoors and mucking out and doing all the kind of stuff which is so different to my professional life. But I do the same thing every day and it works. Horse quite likes me. I'm outside. I feel tired. I'm not someone who can really relax and sit around for high levels of wellbeing and involvement. But when you think about this, and you think about this for yourself as well as for your children, what comes out of that is Professor Ferre Laevers' rationale that to be highly involved, you have to have a high level of well-being, which makes sense. Think about if you're at work and you're worried about someone at home, or a child is anxious about who's picking them up, or your well-being is low because you're tired or you're hungry, your involvement, your engagement in what you're doing is lower. But what Ferre would also say is actually your involvement in something needs to be high for your well-being to be high. And I don't know about you, I could be really, really tired with work, but if I'm loving it, my well-being's great. I've got the bags under the eyes and I look exhausted, but I'm buzzing because I'm enjoying it so much. And that state of flow is where we want our children to be, hence measuring it to create that. Okay, Abby, next one, please. Thank you. So there are two processes to measure wellbeing and involvement. One is scanning, which I'm not going to talk about today, but is something that is a really fascinating process, because with scanning, it's not about individual children. You are measuring wellbeing and involvement in the overall offer of the classroom. And basically, you would choose 10 children randomly, observe them for 2 minutes at a time, and then make an average. And then Ferre's work talks about 5 interventions to increase the wellbeing and involvement averages in your classroom. And we use that a lot now at Wellington as part of everyday practice. What I'm going to talk about today is screening, which is the more well-known use of the Leuven scales. And that's about evaluating how children are doing in the setting. And it can be used against children. It can also be used to see how effective your learning environment is. Okay, Abby, next one, please. Thank you. And for me, this kind of sums it up, the Leuven scales. This is Ferre Laevers would call this a concept of care width, which may be translated very beautifully from the Flemish, and it's a very kind of research-based title. I call it the heat lamp. And anybody in there, I've seen one or two friends and people I've worked with them in their schools will know I talk about the heat lamp all the time. Pupil progress meetings, whole school review meetings of any age group. The children under that heat lamp are thriving. Doesn't mean they are the highest attainers, but that doesn't matter. Whatever you're doing is you're maximizing the potential of that child. On the 1 to 5 scale of the Leuven scales, they are your 4s and your 5s. They're the ones who have that bounce back ability, that resilience. I've actually known children, if we've talked to them about the Leuven scales, if they're 6 or 7 years old, come in and say, I'm a 5 today. They're right under that heat lamp. The children who are on really far away from the heat lamp with those terribly sad faces, they are your 1s and 2s. They're the ones who immediately, if you're looking at that heat lamp now and you think about your class, you'll know who's right under the middle of the heat lamp. And you'll also know the ones who are right at the edge. And by this point in the term, there's probably a reason. There's a reason either from home, there's they may be diagnosed with something that in terms of learning support that they need extra help. But most children are under the heat lamp, or the really interesting ones, the ones at the edge. They're what we would call the average. On a 1 to 5 scale, they're your 3s. Now, I used to work for a group called Early Excellence, and we developed a tracking system called ECIS, and we would call 3s amber. But it was only when I worked directly with Ferre Laevers, he said, amber's not good enough. 3's not good enough. We have a professional responsibility as educators to get them under that heat lamp. Whether it is their physical, their psychological, their emotional, support for their academics, their intellect is not interesting enough, whatever it is, we don't know that child well enough if they're a 3. If they are performing constantly at a middle of the road level of wellbeing and involvement, we need to find out what it is that we don't know about them to get them under that heat lamp. Okay, thanks, Abby. And so here are the standards. The standards or the descriptors. So it's not an arbitrary having a guess at whether a child is a 1 to 5. We use these standards as an observation tool. Now, when I first started using the Leuven scales, I would do this for baseline within the first 2 weeks of knowing children. I wouldn't now. I might do it with older children, but with little children, it's just too inaccurate, because in the first 2 or 3 weeks, children just may not be settled. So you may say they are a 2 for their well-being or a 2 for their involvement, but hey, 4 weeks later, they're a 4 because they're settled in and you know them better. So I would say we usually do it now towards the end of September, and then we'll do it 3 times across the year. You can see, if you look at the 3s, the moderate, they often are children who may be mistaken for being or having a higher level of involvement because they're compliant. They're the ones who are sitting in the carpet, but their eyes aren't focusing. Someone, I think it was Jessica, talked earlier on about the plasticine. The involvement is high because it's quite hard to use, whereas Play-Doh, you might get 3s. So we would look at these levels, and then each teacher grades a child 1 to 5 on either electronically or on not often on paper now these days, I have to say, but on a score sheet for your class. Okay, next one, Abby, please. So you would group screen your class against those descriptors and those standards through observation. The individual observations analysis, we often call them the tricky 3s. If there are children who you can't quite, they're a bit puzzling, you're not quite sure what level they're at, ask a colleague, talk about those children at home. If they find at home that wellbeing and involvement is higher, it may be just for whatever reason, wellbeing involvement is low in your class. Watch them outdoors. Outdoors in wellbeing involvement may be much higher than indoors. Afternoons may be lower than the mornings, but eventually you'll come to a conclusion about where they are. Then we look at the interventions. Now, the intervention piece is my colleague Rashmi is going to talk about one of her interventions soon. But the system does have a 10-point intervention scale. Again, I'm not going to go into that today, but please do following this. If you want that information, I can give it to you. Examples of interventions are the environment, making sure the learning environment is fit for purpose. A good example might be if they're working in Lego, let's say small Lego, and it's a big pile, a big basket of Lego, but you feel that involvement dips after about 10 minutes. Really simple solution, more Lego boards, more wheels, making sure that everything that's in the environment works and that children know how to use it, or they can make those connections. Interventions often we've used have been about sleep patterns, food, knowing children, and obviously a really obvious one in the context of all your schools is the language of instruction. Really, really making sure children are comfortable with that and that they have that strong sense of attachment, because otherwise that involvement is just not going to go up. I've also had great case studies over the years of teachers finding out that a child was really involved in something at the weekends at home, whether it's on, I mean, honestly, I could go on for hours about things like chickens and fishing, things which were really important to that child. The teacher found out about it, that interest was brought into a project, and whoop, wellbeing involvement went much higher. Okay, thank you. Next one. And this is a very typical recording sheet, whereby you would have the class names down one side and you would circle wellbeing and involvement. If a few people, when we talked to them about the Leuven scales, worry that it's a bit onerous, it's an extra assessment on top of everything else, I, of course, would say actually it's the first and foremost assessment and the first thing to report. But what people realise is that once you've got those class names, particularly if they're children you know, even if you've had it for a month, you will zip down there. You'll know your ones and you'll know your fours. The ones you'll have to observe again will be your threes. They're the ones you'll have to, you'll think, actually, well, I'm not sure. I don't know. They're the children that I really have to watch. So you would record here or electronically, and then you will get, we would use ISAM's Power BI. We now use commercial systems like Learning Ladders to Excel. To really, it really helps if you can have a graphical representation of levels of wellbeing involvement in your class, in your year group, and for me as a whole school. Okay, next one, please. Thank you. So this is an example, a graphical representation of what we would use. This is from our school in Pune. Looking at that bottom one, baseline, the first few weeks where children were. And now a caveat for this is we've got very, very small classes in Pune at the moment. So the 25% might be one child. But graphically, gives it that gravitas and that power. And when I went right at the beginning, I was talking about why I think the Leuven scales are so important and so influential in whole schools and whole school groups, and particularly through schools, is because it speaks the same language as the rest of your leadership team. And looking at, so for instance, we had a case in Shanghai International in our reception classes. We recognized that we had a group of children who were meeting the early learning goal, but we were expecting them to have exceeded it. When we really knuckled down and really kind of cleansed that data, we saw that the children whose wellbeing and involvement was not that high were our first English language speakers. Now, this was in a Chinese school where, well, in a school in China where most of our children have a Chinese heritage background. And really, the language of the classroom, the language of the school is Chinese. But staff children, 1 or 2 children who came with English as a first language, they weren't really making progress. They were like this. And we realised they were a bit bored. We were spending so much time, rightly, in one sense, supporting our second, third language learners. The children who came in with English were not as motivated. So by looking at data like this and recognising, by raising their involvement, raising their motivation, upping the ante, if you like, raising the levels of challenge, progress went up as well in communication and language and English. Okay, thank you. Next one. So another quick breakout room. We're just going to give 3 or 4 minutes on this one. I want you to think about in your breakout rooms, or to talk about, if you do this kind of thing already, whether using the Leuven scales or using anything in the system, and also how might this enhance your current assessment systems, whether it's reporting it, and you might report in a narrative session, you might not use graphical representation. Those of you who are leaders in the room, how would this support your strategic aims for you as a school, and also in terms of influencing others in school of different age phases? So do you use it already, and how might it enhance your current assessment systems? Okay, thank you. Is anyone out of interest? Is anybody, give me a little hand, using the Leuven scales at the moment in their school or about to? Sarah.
I'm about to do. I've used it in prior settings, but we haven't used it in our school. Well, as far as I know, they haven't used it where I am at the moment. And I'm about to start a research project with the kids outside, a participatory research project, to find out what their perception is of the outdoor space. Because we assume as adults, they love playing outside, don't they? They love it. And we get them to go out in all weathers. And I wanted to write a journal piece about actually what do they think. So that's what I'm doing. But as part of this participatory research, I wanted to triangulate it with something. And remembering in an old setting where we use the Leuven scale quite kind of systematically, I thought, well, that would be perfect. So I'm going to try, so as well as observing the kids and getting them interviews and getting them to tell me and draw lovely maps and things, I will try and map them, so to speak, by the Leuven scale to see if that triangulates with what they're saying. And I think it would make an interesting thing for our senior leadership. And then hopefully it could be kind of a push to say, how about we do this as a regular systematic thing? Yeah. So yeah, that's where I'm at the moment.
Yeah, it's a great idea. And of course, they were originally developed for research. That was, and although they've been, I mean, I think the thing for Professor Ferre Laevers is sometimes he worries that they're watered down a little bit, which is why the next bit I'm going to talk about is the so what aspect of it. But yeah, I mean, I would advocate using them for monitoring quality, but massively for research. I think that's really interesting. Anybody else use them or thinks how it might enhance what they do?
I was saying, Fiona, that we have used them in the past, but in a different way to the way you described. So we had them more on the back of a learning observation to sort of reflect on how engaged children were at that point in time. Our foundation team have stepped away from it, and I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe the way we were using it wasn't giving them useful information.
Yeah. And I think that's a really interesting point. I think when people stop using them, or they use them as part of a commercial tracker or something, then if they haven't been allowed to, or they haven't had the time invested in analysing the data and reporting it, then it can be seen as just another thing that you've got to do. And when we started doing it at Wellington, I did say we had we called them lead practitioners, 2 ambassadors in each school who were trained, and then they disseminated that information in their own school at different paces. Some schools did it kind of with bells on within the first year. Some took a couple of years, but the whole idea was it wasn't going to be a project after 2 years. It was going to be it was going to be instrumental in everything we did. But taking your point, I also had to persuade every board of every school that the first thing we were going to report on was this before anything else, because it made us accountable, but it also kind of made other people accountable to listen to it and give it that seriousness. Louise, do you use them at the moment?
Yes, I've just started introducing them to my new school, but I first started using them when I was doing my MPQML, when I was working at a different school at Patina. And I did my MPQML twice because of COVID. So the first time was within outdoor learning, and that was really helpful to track the engagement indoors and outside. And we saw really high levels of engagement outside compared to inside. So that was great to reassure everyone of the benefits. But I also did my MPQML based on literacy and play-based learning. And then this is where I would do sort of timed, I'd come at different times in the day, and I'd take a snapshot of where everyone was in our very large free flow environment. And I'd look at the literacy opportunities and where were those really high levels of engagement, usually during those child initiated moments rather than the adult directed or adult guided. And I would take photos and videos of those moments, and we'd kind of unpick where there'd been really high levels of engagement and motivation within literacy. In our staff meetings, we would notice what were the things that we thought made the children really engaged, and how could we learn on that and build that practice.
And I think, you know, you remind me, Louise, if and linked to what Sarah first said, anyone knows Patina, the early years is this huge internal space with all these kind of wonderful breakout rooms, but actually in terms of making sure children are involved rather than flitting from one thing to another to another to another, it's really important. And Sarah, I really take your point about outdoors. You know, a really obvious one is bicycles. You know, children on trikes going round and round and round. Well, their well-being might be okay, but what's their level of involvement? And actually, I would argue by reception age 4, 5, should they have them? Is it too easy? You know, so it can bust a lot of myths. It raises a lot of questions and it challenges a lot of things, but at least you're measuring what's really, really meaningful. Thank you, everybody. I could talk about this for hours, but next one, because we haven't got hours. Thanks, Abby. Okay, so this is about an assessment side. To me, the Leuven scales are just as important a form of data as whether it's literacy, maths, understanding the world, or those other areas, you know, PSCD, the other aspect of how we try and understand and unpick children's development and where they are. If I'm doing a school review or working with a group of schools, I always use what we just used at Ofsted a long time ago, which was tell me, show me, so what. So tell me about your school, about your class, and some of that will be numerical data, some of it will be a narrative. Show me how you know. So of course, here we have these very objective descriptors around children's behaviour through observation. This is how I know. I've checked the threes, my colleague watched with me, da, da, da. But the part that's often missed with Leuven is the so what. Going back to, I think, what you were saying, Charlotte, in terms of why do people just kind of falls by the wayside. So the so what aspect is obviously just as important as the measuring of it. For this next 5-10 minutes, I'm going to ask my colleague Rashmi. Now, Rashmi was with our school in Tianjin, in our bilingual nursery in Tianjin for a few years. And before then, I think, Rashmi, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you might have been in Taiwan. We are super lucky because the ideal international teacher, she has come back to her home city, I think, of Pune, to help open our brand new school there. But what I really loved about Rashmi's case study she's going to share with you is she's working in not just a new school, but a whole new region for Wellington with a whole new cohort of pupils who are not all Indian families. There's quite a lot of children there who've just come to India themselves as well. And I know, Rashmi, you're going to talk to us about checking children's levels of wellbeing involvement, and they were a bit average. And so you're going to talk to us about how you raise those levels through a recent project. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Could I have the next slide, please? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So great. So as Fiona was telling you all, we've just opened in Pune, and I have only 5 children in year 1, hoping they won't remain 5. However, when they just arrived, about 4 out of the 5 are children who have just relocated to India from some other countries. They don't call this their home. So when they arrived beginning of school year, it's a new school, it's a new country. They're still learning to separate themselves from their parents, coming into a brand new setting. Some of them didn't speak English at all. But as time went by and we started observing the children, we saw that, like we spoke about before, different times of the day, they showed different levels of well-being and involvement. And outside, as you can see in the sand pits, in the malleable areas, the mud kitchen, they really showed very high levels of well-being and involvement. So what we decided, because as you can see in the provocation, clay and artifacts made out of clay are such a huge part of Indian culture. And when children started their journey with us, they were so proud about where they're from and tried to represent that I had a child from Korea, I have a child from New Zealand, and they all wanted to be represented and wanted to talk about their flags, their countries, where they're from, and now to a brand new country in India. So we decided to merge those cultural aspects and make that connection between where they're from to where they are right now, and also include their interests in our project. So pottery is, or any clay artifact in India, especially around the festival of Diwali, it's a huge means of sustenance for so many people in India. So we thought, why not bring that in and talk to the children about where this is coming from and get them to really experiment where they showed those high levels of well-being and involvement. So as you can see in that provocation, we have different artifacts from different parts of India, and we have a little tray of mud and sand and clay. And we asked them, okay, if when you look at these artifacts, what do you think that they're made out of? And that was such an excellent opportunity for children to get back in there, to start experimenting with these three materials. And they all made a spider web and they all voted. It was beautiful to watch. And they finally decided that it was indeed made out of clay. In the second picture, you will see that the boy has brought this clay pot outside, and he said, okay, I am going to make a pot just like this in sand. And he was so happy, and the other boys watching him, and then he finally did join him. So he started molding and started using these amazing words like molding and pinching and digging and making things hollow. So he made that pot out of sand, and the first thing he did was try to pour water into that sand pot, and obviously it didn't hold. And that was such a beautiful example of him conducting such a simple experiment outside, and the level of well-being and involvement was just worth watching. And then he came back inside, and as you can see down there, he's made a really beautiful journal entry. I was making a pot with sand. I mixed water and sand. I molded it with my hands, and then I poured the water in the pot. And over there, you'll see a group of children just experimenting with me. So we had the mortar and the pestle. We're just pounding the bricks, pounding broken artifacts and seeing what colors they are, etc. And one thing that really stood out to the children was, if you look at the picture, the clay artifacts are all different colors, or slightly different. So we then started talking about that, like what is happening? Why are they all clay, and why are they all different colors? Can we move to the next slide, please? Okay, so that is when we started talking about, okay, where does this clay come from? Where are all the major rivers in India? How is clay harvested? And there we are, all of us finding Pune on the map. And then we thought, okay, this is a really good time for us to learn about directions. So we learned about north, south, cardinal directions, and we invited an expert speaker. So that is our operations and compliance officer right there. And he came and spoke to our children about the different sides of our building. So what best than to give them that real life experience of placing themselves in India and then building up their knowledge. So we rode a bus maybe 500 steps away, because it's just like one building away. That's where the 3D model was. So we rode the bus, we went over there, and you will see children with the clipboards while Mr. Dilip is talking to them about what does it look like now? Where's the north and the south and the east and the west? Where's the river? So they all got with them a checklist of the different physical features of where we are. Some found rivers. There's a very beautiful river that flows behind our campus, so they found the direction for that. They found some trees, they found our gate, and then they also found some things that were not on the checklist, so they decided to draw those things and then find which direction they were. And then we came back into the classroom and read this book called Me on a Map. Me on a Map really helped us reflect on our trip, because this is a story about a girl who starts with her bedroom, and then she goes to the map of her room, and then she goes to the map of her house and her street, her neighborhood, her town, her state, and her country. So it was really a beautiful way for them to start talking about what they had done, how they had recorded it, and then proceeded towards making a really big map of the school. So there you are, the last picture. You will see that they brought back all the knowledge, and then they've made their own map with the north and the south and the east and the west. So this is where we are in our project. Our next steps and what has just happened in our outdoor area is we started taking the mapping and the language and all of that outside, started building models. So if I can move on to the next slide, I will show you what are some of the next steps right after this. Mm-hmm. There we are. So we've got some bricks. We're really lucky because we're actually in a construction site. So we have access to bricks, a lot of bricks. So we got those bricks out, and then we were starting to make the 3D model ourselves. There you will see all the children have built an airplane out of crates, and then we flew, and you can see the flags right there. So we looked at the flags and we flew in different directions. Some wanted to fly north, some wanted to go to New Zealand. So it was really just bringing that language back and consolidating it in such a beautiful way. And in the block area as well, children said, oh, you know what the school needs is parking. We don't have decent parking. And then there they are, they're building a parking lot on the second floor of the building. And they said, oh, it'll be really cool to have a bridge from block A to block B. And there they are building a bridge and showing us how a bridge can be built. So this is where we are with our whole project-based approach. So from the beginning, when we first did our baseline, where their well-being and involvement was average, now we've just finished our end of term 1 data, and the progress is just immense. It's amazing. So I vouch for the Leuven scales.
Thank you, Rashmi. It's a
Absolutely.
great example there. I think particularly around that sense of belonging that raises children's level of well-being. As we say, lots of different languages, a very different place for India, for them to live. And I also think it's a good example. We talk a lot about raising children's involvement, and in child-initiated learning, connecting children with their interests. But what this is about is also introducing new interests. Children don't know what they're interested in yet all the time. And so it's about unlocking those children, bringing them back under that heat lamp.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, and then last slide, please, Abby. Okay. I think this really is, for me, is just a summary. I suppose what I want to say about the Leuven scales is it's much more than an assessment system. It really is about mindsets and process. It's to adopt the Leuven scales and to use them and to really use them to their full extent. It is about, as a school, recognising that high levels of well-being, high levels of involvement are the real keys to success. And whatever we do, we need to create that. That needs to be central to however we are organising our teaching, our timetables, our learning environments, our staffing ratios, how we support our parents, all of those things. It's also a really great way for your vision to be in practice. You know, we've all got very similar visions for our children, and we know what we want for them, and we want our children to be literate and highly confident in mathematics and all of those things. But high levels of wellbeing involvement will support that. I would say at first I would all suggest probably three seasonal, as Ferre would call it, key points across the year to track wellbeing and involvement and support interventions. But then eventually it will become much more natural than that, much more fluid. I mean, is there anything else one last thing, Rashmi, anything else for you to offer? You know,
Yes,
I know you're
actually,
a
I
convert.
wanted to share just one very, very interesting, amazing case that I'm really proud of in Pune. So we've had a Danish boy join us, beginning a reception, has 3 older brothers and sisters also in school. This boy did not speak any English, no English whatsoever. So when he came in the mornings, beginning of the year, he was just for 45 minutes howling, screaming, did not want to talk to anyone. But some of the steps that we took now, his progress is just, you can't even tell it's the same child. So what we started doing is started to meet him informally, even before the school year started. So we met the family, we had the All About Me form, taking all of that information into account and seeing how well we can comfort him, immediately assigned a key person for him, gave him his space when he needed it. We even learned some Danish. So all of that really helped him and really helped us as well to really learn how to support a child that comes to you with no language whatsoever. And how do you build it up? And now that boy is making sentences. May I go to the toilet, please? Can I go wash my hands? Yummy snack. It's just beautiful to watch, going from 0 to so far, just by doing a few little things and really personalizing our approach to each and every child. So I just wanted to gloat about that for a minute.
Well, and gloat away. And I think there's so many of you hearing Rashmi's great stories of what you do. But the very fact that you're using you're really measuring and monitoring that shows you what is successful, but it also shows you what you don't know yet. And that's a great example, Rashmi, of knowing the child. That's the iceberg. You know, knowing the child who always just has to have that one last wave to mummy at the edge over there. The child who's, you know, I've worked with children who, as long as if the only way to comfort them was to put them on your back, and then they were fine. You know, just it's those little things. And the whole theory behind this is if high levels of wellbeing, high levels of involvement, we will unlock the potential of all our children. I will say very quickly, I do know some schools who use this with staff in terms of supporting staff development as well. And it's phenomenal. It obviously, you know, there can be a can of worms there that you unlock, but so you have to be able to act on any of those interventions. I am a great advocate. Now, I've seen there are some questions in there. I know we're kind of running out of time now. What I would suggest is, and I'm speaking on behalf of ECIS, this is such a big topic that if people were interested in almost doing a kind of 3-part series, something where and it wouldn't be about me, it would be about me inviting some of the teachers I've worked with at Wellington over the years on how they've implemented it. It's 6 years in the making now, and it's part of every induction day in August. And all our governors now are fully brainwashed in the understanding rationale and the gravitas of wellbeing and involvement. So I'd be very happy to kind of give people more information. We're always really willing to share, whether it's paperwork or whether it's systems and the interventions that we've used. Okay, I think we have to go. I'm seeing all sorts of things saying it's it's time to finish. Can I thank you? A big thank you to Rashmi. I know it's super late there in India, and it's a tough old gig opening a school with lots of new children. So a big clap to you, and thank you for sharing.
Absolutely, it's been such a pleasure.
Oh, thank you again. And we'll try and do. Oh, look at that! Thank you, Elizabeth. I like the balloons. We'll try and do the next ones maybe a little bit earlier in the day, so some of our colleagues from East Asia haven't got to stay up all night. Okay, thanks everyone. I think